Imagine boarding a flight, expecting nothing but a quiet trip home, only to witness a moment that would leave an entire plane in stunned silence. A man dismissed as just another passenger suddenly becomes the center of attention when the truth about who he really is revealed. And the person who underestimated him the most, she never saw it coming. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Leonard Leo Henshaw adjusted the strap of his worn-out backpack as he stepped into the bustling terminal of JFK International Airport. The air smelled of jet fuel and fresh brewed coffee from the overpriced cafes lining the concourse. Overhead, a voice crackled through the speakers, announcing boarding for a flight to Los Angeles. People bustled around him, their faces focused on their own destinations, their own lives. Leo wasn't in a hurry. He never was. At 65, he had spent decades learning that rushing never did anyone any good. Life had a way of moving forward, whether you sprinted through it or took your time. He preferred the latter. He adjusted his jacket, a simple, well-worn brown coat he had owned for years. It had seen better days, but so had he. Unlike most travelers around him, who dragged sleek, rolling suitcases, Leo carried an old canvas duffel bag slung over one shoulder. It wasn't stylish, but it had been with him through more than he could count, and that meant something. The airport was filled with a mix of emotions: excitement, exhaustion, impatience. A family stood nearby, huddled together, exchanging tearful goodbyes. A businessman, eyes glued to his phone, paced back and forth near the gate, barking instructions into his Bluetooth earpiece. Everyone had somewhere to be. Leo did too. He was heading home to Atlanta after spending a few days in New York visiting his grandson. The boy had just turned 10 and had proudly shown Leo the basketball hoop his mother had installed in their driveway. They had spent the afternoon shooting hoops, laughing as the ball clanked off the rim more times than it swished through the net. He smiled at the memory. It was moments like that that mattered, not the big things: titles, money, prestige, just simple, honest time with people you cared about. As he approached the SkyWest Elite Airways counter to check in, a young woman in a neatly pressed uniform greeted him. Her smile was polite, professional, until her eyes flicked over his clothes, his bag, his shoes. Something in her expression shifted. "Sir, may I see your ticket?" Leo nodded and handed it over. She studied it, then looked back at him, hesitation flickering across her face. "You're flying to Atlanta today?" she asked, as if double-checking. "That's the plan," Leo replied evenly. There was a pause. Not long enough to make a scene, but just enough for Leo to recognize what was happening. He had seen it before. It was in the way her smile faltered, the way she gave him a second, longer look, as if something didn't quite add up. He wasn't wearing a suit, didn't have a designer briefcase. To her, he probably looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong line. "Everything looks good," she said finally, handing his ticket back. "Gate 17, boarding in 30 minutes. "Appreciate it," Leo said, taking his ticket and walking toward security. He had no anger, no irritation, just a quiet understanding. People always made assumptions. It was human nature. What mattered wasn't what they thought. It was how you chose to respond. As he made his way to the gate, he stopped by a small coffee stand. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of cinnamon rolls from a nearby bakery. He ordered a black coffee, nothing fancy, just strong and hot. Taking a seat near a window, he sipped slowly, watching the planes taxiing in the distance. Outside, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the tarmac. Leo had been on countless flights, traveled to places most people would never see, but airports always felt the same. They were places of transition, of arrivals and departures, of hellos and goodbyes. But for him, this wasn't a new beginning or a bittersweet farewell. It was just another flight home. As the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Leo finished the last sip of his coffee, picked up his bag, and walked toward the gate. It was just another trip. Or at least that's what he thought. Leo made his way down the jet bridge, his steps steady, unrushed. The artificial hum of the airplane's ventilation system greeted him as he stepped into the narrow aisle, lined with rows of navy blue seats. The overhead compartments were already half full with neatly tucked away carry-ons, and the faint scent of fabric cleaner mixed with recycled air. Passengers were settling in, some scrolling through their phones, others tucking travel pillows behind their necks, preparing for the 2-hour flight to Atlanta. A mother a few rows ahead was helping her daughter buckle her seatbelt, while a man in a business suit furiously typed away on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. Leo moved down the aisle, checking his seat number. 22B, a middle seat. Not ideal, but he wasn't one to complain. He had spent years sleeping on the ground in places far less comfortable. Just as he was about to stow his bag, he felt a presence beside him, a flight attendant. Blonde hair pinned back in a perfect bun, uniform crisp, her expression carefully controlled. "Sir, can I see your ticket again?" she asked, voice polite, but with a hint of something else. Leo raised an eyebrow but handed it over without hesitation. She scanned it, her eyes darting back and forth between him and the small printed seat number. Then after a pause, she forced a thin smile. "You're in 22B, she confirmed, handing it back. "That's what it says," Leo replied. She hesitated for a moment longer before stepping aside, allowing him to continue. As he placed his bag in the overhead compartment, he caught a glance from a man sitting across the aisle. A brief passing look, quick but unmistakable, the kind that assessed, categorized, and dismissed all in the span of a few seconds. Leo had seen that look before. Taking his seat, he exhaled slowly, resting his hands on his knees. The plane filled with the usual pre-flight commotion, the shuffle of feet, the beep of seatbelt signs, the crackling voice of the captain over the intercom. Then from a few rows ahead, a voice cut through the quiet murmur of the cabin. "God, what is that smell?" Leo didn't react at first. He had learned a long time ago that not every fight was worth fighting. But then another voice chimed in, softer, but with an edge of irritation. "Yeah, it's kind of strong, like sweat," and the sentence trailed off, but the implication was clear. Leo kept his gaze forward, his face unreadable. And then, as if on cue, the blonde flight attendant reappeared. Rebecca Caldwell, her name tag read. She glanced in the direction of the murmuring passengers before her eyes landed on Leo once more. This time, she didn't bother hiding her discomfort. She stepped closer, lowering her voice but keeping it just loud enough to be heard by those nearby. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right seat? Maybe you'd be more comfortable in another row?" Leo turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze. "I'm fine right here." She hesitated, shifting on her feet. "It's just, we want to make sure all our passengers have a pleasant experience." Leo let the words settle. A pleasant experience. "That's so?" he said, his voice even. Rebecca offered a strained smile. "Of course, we want everyone to feel comfortable." Leo nodded, his gaze steady. "Then maybe you should start by treating me like every other passenger on this plane." A flicker of something, frustration, embarrassment, perhaps both, crossed her face. She pressed her lips into a thin line, then without another word, turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the front of the cabin. Leo leaned back in his seat, exhaling through his nose. The thing about moments like these, they told you exactly who people were. The plane hummed as it climbed higher, the city lights of New York fading beneath a thick blanket of clouds. The seatbelt sign flickered off with a soft chime, and passengers shifted in their seats, settling in for the 2-hour journey to Atlanta. Leo sat still, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the seat in front of him. He had been through worse. A few uncomfortable stares and whispered comments weren't anything new. Across the aisle, a man in his 40s, dressed in business casual, was watching him. Subtly at first, but then with a look of curiosity. Leo felt it, that quiet sense of recognition, though he didn't acknowledge it just yet. A flight attendant, this time a younger man with neatly combed hair, pushed a beverage cart down the aisle, his smile effortless as he handed out drinks. "Would you like anything, sir?" he asked when he reached Leo's row. "Just water," Leo said. The young attendant handed him a small bottle and moved on. Rebecca, however, stood near the front, arms crossed as she spoke quietly with another flight attendant. Every now and then, her eyes flickered back toward Leo, her lips pursed. Leo ignored it. Instead, he unscrewed the cap of his water bottle and took a slow sip, letting his mind drift. The last time he had been on a plane, it was to Texas for a military reunion. Old faces, firm handshakes, shared stories that grew grander with each retelling. Most of them had changed. Hair grayer, backs stiffer, voices a little softer, but the bond remained. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Leo turned. It was the man from across the aisle. He leaned slightly toward him, hesitant but intrigued. "I don't mean to bother you," the man said, "but you look familiar." Leo studied him for a moment. "That's so. Yeah." The man nodded, thoughtful. "Were you in the military?" Leo didn't answer right away. He wasn't the kind to advertise his past, but something about the way the man asked, without arrogance, without assumption, made him consider. "Yeah," Leo finally said. "A long time ago." The man's expression shifted, like a puzzle piece had just clicked into place. "I thought so. My father was Army. I grew up around guys like you. There's just a way you carry yourself." Leo huffed a quiet breath, neither confirming nor denying it. The man extended a hand. "Greg Sanders," he introduced himself. Leo shook it, a firm grip. No pretense. "Leo Henshaw." A flicker of recognition crossed Greg's face at the name, but he didn't push. Instead, he simply nodded. "It's good to meet you, sir." Leo gave a small nod in return, then turned back to his water. He wasn't one for long conversations, but something told him this flight wasn't going to let him stay unnoticed for much longer. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight settled into its routine hum. Conversations grew quieter, blending with the steady drone of the engines. Outside the window, the vast night sky stretched endlessly, a dark canvas dotted with scattered stars. Leo remained in his seat, unmoving, his hands resting on his lap. He had spent a lifetime learning how to make himself small when necessary, to take up just enough space to exist, but not enough to draw unwanted attention. Yet attention had found him anyway. Greg Sanders, the man across the aisle, was still watching him. Less out of curiosity now, and more out of quiet realization. "You said your name was Leo Henshaw," Greg finally spoke, keeping his voice low. Leo didn't respond immediately. He had spent decades with that name. In most places, it meant nothing. In some places, it meant everything. Greg leaned forward slightly, his brows drawn together. "I read about you," he continued. "Years ago. You were—" Leo gave a slight shake of his head, cutting him off. "That was a long time ago," he said. Greg hesitated, then nodded, understanding. "Still," he said after a beat, "it's not something people forget." Leo didn't argue. The past had a way of following you, no matter how far you tried to leave it behind. A few rows ahead, Rebecca Caldwell stood near the beverage cart, flipping through a small notebook as she pretended not to listen. But Leo knew she was. He had caught her glancing back more times than she probably realized. She had written him off as insignificant the moment she saw him. Now she was trying to figure out if she had made a mistake. The weight of his name had changed the air around him. He could feel it. A slight shift in how Greg spoke to him. The way some passengers nearby had started sneaking glances, whispering, "People always treated you differently when they thought you mattered." "Mr. Henshaw," Greg said, his voice steady, "if you don't mind me asking, why are you sitting in economy? I mean, someone like you, I figured." Leo lifted a brow. "Someone like me?" Greg hesitated, then exhaled, shaking his head. "That came out wrong. I just mean, well, I don't see a lot of guys with your history back here." Leo let the silence hang for a moment before answering. "I don't need a big seat to get where I'm going." Greg let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head in what might have been admiration. "Fair enough," he said. Across the aisle, Rebecca's grip on her notebook tightened just a little. Leo didn't have to look at her to know what was going through her mind. She was realizing that she had underestimated him. And for people like her, that realization was always uncomfortable. The cabin remained quiet, save for the occasional clatter of an ice cube against a plastic cup or the soft hum of the aircraft cutting through the night sky. Outside the window, Atlanta was still a faraway glow on the horizon. Leo sat still, his gaze forward, his breathing steady. Years of discipline had taught him patience. He didn't stir when he felt the weight of lingering stares or the shift in the energy around him. He had seen it too many times before. The slow unraveling of assumptions, the moment people realized they had misjudged him. Greg had gone quiet now, though every so often he glanced toward Leo as if debating whether to say more. But it wasn't Greg that held Leo's attention. Rebecca Caldwell, the flight attendant who had so easily dismissed him earlier, was hovering near the front of the cabin, her back straight, fingers drumming lightly against her service tray. She had heard the name. Leo could see it in the way her posture had stiffened, the way she now moved with a hint of hesitation that hadn't been there before. He had spent his whole life watching people navigate their own discomfort, some masking it better than others. And right now, Rebecca was still trying to decide how to react. When she finally moved, it wasn't toward him, it was toward Greg. She leaned down slightly, offering a pleasant, controlled smile. "Sir, would you like anything else to drink?" Greg blinked, caught off guard. No, I'm good. Thanks." She hesitated for just a second before shifting her attention to Leo. It was subtle the way she looked at him now, like she was trying to reconcile two versions of the same person, the one she had judged before and the one she now realized she had misread. "Would you like anything, Mr. Henshaw?" she asked, and this time she said his name carefully. Leo glanced up, meeting her gaze. He could see the effort behind her expression, the attempt to recalibrate, to course correct. He considered it for a beat longer than necessary, then simply shook his head. "I'm fine." Rebecca nodded quickly, almost relieved, and stepped away. Greg exhaled softly, shaking his head. "Well, that was different." Leo didn't respond, because here was the thing. People rarely changed in the span of a few minutes. More often than not, they just adjusted how they played the game. The plane continued its steady course toward Atlanta, the dim cabin lights casting a soft glow over the passengers who had started to settle in for the remainder of the flight. Conversations had faded to hushed murmurs, the occasional clink of ice against a cup or the shuffle of a passenger adjusting their seat, breaking the quiet rhythm of the journey. Leo remained still. He wasn't one for unnecessary movement, not when stillness had always been his greatest advantage. But the air had changed. Rebecca Caldwell was different now. She moved through the aisle with a new awareness, her previous certainty replaced with something else, hesitation, maybe even regret. She had spent the first part of this flight convinced that Leo was just another nobody in a middle seat, someone easily overlooked. But now, she wasn't so sure. Leo didn't need to turn his head to know she was watching him again. He could feel it in the way she lingered just a little too long at the front of the cabin, in how she stole quick glances when she thought no one was paying attention. She was trying to piece it together, trying to understand why his name mattered. Greg, still seated across the aisle, cleared his throat softly. "You know," he said, keeping his voice low, "I can't tell if she feels bad or if she's just trying to cover her ass." Leo let out a quiet breath, something close to amusement, but not quite. "Does it matter?" he asked. Greg tilted his head. "To you? Maybe not. But to her?" He let the words hang. "I think it does." Leo said nothing, because in his experience, people didn't like realizing they had misjudged someone. They especially didn't like realizing they had done it in front of others. Rebecca's voice came over the intercom just then, announcing the final drink service before descent. Her tone was professional, smooth, but Leo caught the slight stiffness in it, the weight of something unspoken pressing against her words. And then, as if drawn to him by something beyond her control, she made her way back down the aisle and stopped at his row. She held the drink tray with both hands, her knuckles just barely whitening against the edges. "Mr. Henshaw," she said carefully, "are you sure I can't get you anything before we begin our descent?" Leo finally looked up at her then, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched just long enough to make her shift slightly on her feet. He could have let her linger there, could have made her stew in whatever conflict was playing out in her mind, but he didn't. Instead, he just shook his head once. "I'm good." Rebecca hesitated. She wanted to say something else. He could see it in the way her lips parted slightly before she stopped herself. Then, with a quick nod, she turned and walked away. Greg let out a quiet chuckle. "She's sweating now." Leo didn't smile, but there was something knowing in his eyes. People like her, he said, always do when they realize they played their hand too soon. The plane began its slow descent, and Rebecca Caldwell wasn't the only one shifting in her seat now. The plane had begun its gradual descent, the shift in altitude pressing gently against the ears of those who weren't used to it. Passengers stirred, adjusting their seats, stretching their legs, preparing for the final leg of the journey. Overhead compartments rattled softly with the movement of the aircraft. Leo sat still. He had never been one to fidget, not even in moments of uncertainty. Across the aisle, Greg seemed to be studying him again, but this time, the look in his eyes was different. Not just curiosity, but something closer to respect. "You don't like talking about it, do you?" Greg finally asked. Leo turned his head slightly, considering the question. "About what?" Greg gave a knowing smile. "You know what?" Leo didn't answer right away. He had been asked that question before, sometimes by reporters, sometimes by young recruits eager to hear stories of war, of glory, of survival. But those weren't stories he ever told. "It's not that I don't like talking about it," Leo finally said. "It's just that most people don't really want to listen. They want a version of it that fits the way they already see the world." Greg leaned back slightly, nodding. "And you don't feel like giving them that?" Leo didn't confirm or deny it. Greg exhaled through his nose, thoughtful. "I get it," he said. "My old man, he was a Vietnam vet. Never talked about it much either. I used to think it was because he didn't want to remember. But as I got older, I realized it was because he knew most people wouldn't understand." Leo gave a slow nod. People wanted war stories, but only the ones that sounded like movies. They didn't want the ones where the hero wasn't invincible, where decisions haunted you long after the battles had ended. Greg's voice dropped slightly. "But I do remember one thing he said once. It stuck with me." Leo glanced at him. "What was that?" Greg's jaw tensed for a second before he spoke. He said, "The hardest part isn't what you see over there. It's coming back and realizing the world kept moving like nothing happened." Leo looked at him for a long moment, and then for the first time on this flight, he nodded, not just in acknowledgement, but in understanding. Greg's father had been right. The hardest part had never been what they endured. It was stepping off the plane and realizing the people around them had never lived a single second of it. Leo turned his gaze back to the window, watching as the city lights of Atlanta grew closer. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself remember. The plane glided lower, the faint glow of streetlights below beginning to sharpen into roads, buildings, and neighborhoods. Atlanta was coming into focus. Leo watched the world below without really seeing it. His mind had drifted elsewhere, somewhere far away from the gentle hum of the aircraft and the muted conversations of weary passengers. War had a way of doing that. It didn't just live in memories. It found ways to slip into the quietest corners of a man's mind, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Greg had stirred something in him with that last remark, something Leo usually kept buried. He had been young when he first enlisted, young and full of belief, the kind of belief that made a man think he could outrun fear, that he could stare down death and walk away unchanged. But war had different plans. He could still remember the sand, the heat, the weight of his gear digging into his shoulders, the sharp bark of orders over the radio, the way the air smelled just before the first shots rang out. And he remembered the moment it changed him. The mission had been routine, or so they'd thought. A simple recon, in and out. Nothing they hadn't done a dozen times before, until the explosion, until the dust and fire swallowed everything, and suddenly routine didn't exist anymore. Leo had reacted on instinct, pulling a young soldier, barely 20, out of the debris. The kid had been trembling, his face streaked with dirt and blood, eyes wide with something beyond fear. "Stay with me," Leo had told him, gripping his vest, dragging him to cover. "You're all right." The kid had believed him, and Leo had believed it too, until he felt the warmth spreading across his own side, until he looked down and saw the blood soaking through his uniform. He had almost died that day. Should have, maybe. But fate had other plans. Leo exhaled slowly, blinking the memory away. The past had a habit of creeping in when least expected, but he had spent years learning how to push it back where it belonged. Beside him, Greg had gone quiet, as if sensing the shift in Leo's presence. Rebecca, too, had fallen strangely silent. She had spent the flight keeping her distance, but now she seemed caught in a quiet internal battle. He could see it in the way she lingered near the galley, in the way she stole quick glances but never quite met his eyes. Maybe she was wondering if she had misjudged him. Maybe she was realizing she had. It didn't matter. People like her always noticed too late. The plane jolted slightly as the landing gear deployed, a soft vibration running through the floor beneath Leo's feet. The overhead speakers crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent into Atlanta. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright position." The city below stretched wider now, the roads glowing like veins under a street lamp. Leo tightened his seatbelt, keeping his gaze forward. One flight. That was all this was. One more trip from one place to another. And yet, something about it felt different. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the only one carrying the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. The plane's wheels kissed the runway with a slight jolt, and the familiar hum of engines slowing filled the cabin. Outside, Atlanta's city lights sprawled beneath the night sky, stretching far beyond the airport's glowing terminals. Leo remained still as passengers around him began to stir, reaching for bags, stretching stiff limbs, shaking off the haze of the flight. Greg let out a low whistle, rubbing his hands together. Back on solid ground. Leo gave a small nod. He had landed in plenty of places before. Some felt like relief. Others felt like the start of something worse. This was just another landing, or so he thought. The usual post-flight announcements crackled through the speakers, but something about the captain's voice carried an unusual weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated for a moment. We have a special arrival tonight, and we appreciate your patience as we allow a few important guests to deplane first." A ripple of curiosity spread through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. Special guests? Important arrival? Leo's brow furrowed slightly, but he remained quiet. Then he saw it, the way Rebecca stiffened. She stood at the front of the aisle, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her jaw set. Whatever was happening, she already knew. Greg turned to Leo, brow raised. "Think this has something to do with you?" Leo didn't answer. He had a feeling, but he wasn't the type to assume. It wasn't until the door opened and the first figure stepped inside that everything clicked. A soldier in full-dress uniform entered the plane, his expression unreadable, his posture rigid with precision. Behind him, another followed, then another. Rebecca's face paled. Greg sucked in a breath. Jesus! Passengers shifted, some craning their necks to get a better look. A few gasped softly. Others, sensing something bigger than themselves, simply sat in silence. Then a man in his late 40s stepped forward, medals gleaming on his chest, his uniform pressed to perfection. His eyes scanned the cabin, seeking someone, and then they landed on Leo. For the first time since boarding, Trung Tuong Elijah Henshaw looked at his father. Leo's expression didn't change, but something deep within him stirred. Silence stretched as Elijah took a step forward, his boots making a crisp sound against the floor. Then he spoke. "Dad." The word carried more weight than anything else in that moment. Leo let out a slow breath, then pushed himself to his feet. He had never been one for grand entrances, but life had a way of deciding those for you. Around them, passengers whispered in hushed tones, realization dawning. Rebecca stood frozen, her eyes wide, her earlier dismissiveness crumbling into something that looked dangerously close to regret. Leo met his son's gaze, their silent understanding passing between them. He had never needed a hero's welcome, but tonight he was getting one. A hush fell over the cabin. Conversations had died, replaced by the quiet hum of the aircraft and the weight of something unspoken. The presence of uniformed soldiers inside a commercial flight was enough to command attention. But it wasn't the uniforms that held the room still. It was the moment itself. Leo stood, his frame steady, his expression unreadable. He had faced far greater pressures in his lifetime. But this was different. His son, Trung Tuong Elijah Henshaw, stood before him, a man in his own right, but still the boy Leo had raised. the one he had taught how to ride a bike, how to tie a proper knot, how to look a man in the eyes when shaking his hand. Elijah had always been steady, calculated, but right now, in front of all these people, he looked at his father not as a decorated officer, but as a son. "Dad," Elijah repeated, his voice even, but carrying something underneath it, something only a son speaking to his father could hold. Leo inclined his head slightly. "Elijah?" The murmurs in the background grew louder, passengers whispering to one another, piecing together what they had just witnessed. The man they had ignored, the man some had scoffed at, the man Rebecca Caldwell had treated like an afterthought, was the father of one of the highest-ranking officers in the military. Greg, still seated across the aisle, let out a slow exhale. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. Rebecca was stiff. The realization was settling in her eyes, creeping into her posture. She had spent the entire flight treating Leo as if he were invisible. Now she looked like she wished she could disappear. Elijah took a step closer, standing just before his father. There was no grand display, no forced sentimentality, just two men who knew each other in a way no one else in the room did. Leo finally spoke. "You really had to make a scene, huh?" A flicker of amusement crossed Elijah's face. "Didn't plan on it." Leo glanced at the soldiers standing behind his son, the eyes of the entire cabin still fixed on them. "Could have fooled me." Elijah smirked slightly, but then his expression softened. He took another step forward and, without hesitation, reached out and gripped his father's hand. Leo met the grip firmly. In that simple handshake, there was more meaning than any words could hold. Respect, not because of rank, not because of uniforms or medals, but because of who they were, because of the blood, the history, the sacrifices neither of them ever spoke about. And then, without breaking his grip, Elijah straightened and saluted. A sharp, crisp motion, one that carried the weight of every soldier Leo had ever served beside, every battle fought, every sacrifice made. Gasps rippled through the cabin. A few passengers instinctively sat up straighter, some pressing hands over their mouths. Rebecca paled further, her lips parting slightly, but no words came. Greg let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Damn," he said again. "I've never seen anything like this before." Leo held his son's gaze for a beat longer before giving a subtle nod. Elijah dropped the salute and stepped aside. "Let's get you home," he said quietly. Leo exhaled, then reached for his bag. For the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of respect. Not forced, not demanded, just given. And it was heavier than anything he had ever carried. Leo stepped into the aisle, the weight of the moment still thick in the air. Around him, passengers remained in the stunned silence, some staring outright, others lowering their eyes as if suddenly ashamed of their own earlier assumptions. Greg sat back in his seat, shaking his head in quiet admiration. "Hell of a thing to witness," he muttered, almost to himself. Leo didn't respond. He didn't need to. His son, Trung Tuong Elijah Henshaw, stood by the exit, waiting. The other soldiers remained at attention, their presence a quiet but undeniable sign of the respect Leo had never asked for, but had earned nonetheless. Leo reached for his bag. It wasn't much, just a worn canvas duffel that had seen better days, but it was his. He slung it over his shoulder and took a steady step forward. And then, Rebecca Caldwell moved. She was still standing near the front of the cabin, her hands clasped tightly, fingers knotted together. The same woman who had looked at him with thinly veiled irritation at the start of this flight, who had questioned whether he belonged in his seat, who had spoken to him like an inconvenience. Now she looked like she didn't know how to breathe. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Leo watched her, waiting. Rebecca, for all her poise, was unraveling. Guilt clung to her like a shadow. He could see it in the way she swallowed hard, the way her gaze flickered toward the soldiers, toward Elijah, then back to Leo. This wasn't how she had expected this flight to end. She had miscalculated. Badly. Leo didn't say anything. He simply looked at her, patient. Rebecca took a breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Henshaw, She hesitated. What could she say? "I'm sorry" wasn't enough. Not after the way she had dismissed him. Not after she had only started to see him differently once she realized who he was. Leo didn't need an apology. He had met plenty of people like Rebecca before. People who thought respect was something you awarded based on assumptions, who you looked like, where you sat, what you wore. But real respect, that was something different, something given freely, without preconditions. Rebecca seemed to realize that now. Her face tightened, frustration flickering across it, not toward Leo, but toward herself. She lowered her gaze. Leo gave the slightest nod, a gesture so small that most wouldn't have noticed. A silent acknowledgement. And then he walked past her. Rebecca remained still, her hands clenched at her sides. The weight of her mistake would stay with her long after this flight landed. Leo didn't look back. Elijah fell in step beside him as they exited the plane, stepping into the warm Georgia air. The world kept moving, but for some, this flight had changed everything. The terminal was quiet in a way that felt unnatural for an airport. Normally, there was a constant hum of chatter, the shuffle of feet, the rhythmic drone of announcements echoing through the overhead speakers. But here, in this moment, there was only silence. Leo walked with steady steps, his son at his side, the soldiers following a respectful distance behind. There were no words exchanged, none were needed. The weight of the flight still clung to him, though not in the way most would expect. He had spent a lifetime moving through spaces where he was both seen and unseen, where people made assumptions before they ever heard him speak. It had never bothered him, not really, but this time was different. He had watched the change happen in real time. Rebecca Caldwell had walked onto that plane certain of who she thought mattered, certain of who she deemed worthy of her respect. And then, when faced with the truth, she had crumbled under the weight of her own misjudgment. He had seen it in Greg, too, the way he had started the flight as just another friendly stranger. But by the end, he had looked at Leo differently, not because of his title, but because of the kind of man he had come to understand Leo was. And then there were the passengers, those who had looked at him with indifference, even irritation, when he had boarded. Those same people had parted quietly as he exited, their expressions laced with a quiet shame. Leo didn't need their validation, but he hoped they would remember. A slow breath passed through his nose as he continued forward, his boots scuffing against the polished floor. "That was quite the reception," Elijah finally said beside him, voice low. Leo huffed lightly, the closest thing to amusement he'd shown all evening. "Bit much, don't you think?" Elijah smirked. "Wouldn't have done it if I didn't think you deserved it." Leo shook his head slightly. He never had much use for ceremony, but even he had to admit, it hadn't been for him. It had been for them, the ones who had been watching, the ones who would leave this airport thinking differently than when they arrived. They approached the baggage claim, where a few more uniformed men stood at attention, waiting. Passengers from the flight trickled in behind them, now too aware to simply rush past as they normally would. Leo felt Rebecca before he saw her. She was there, standing just near the exit, her posture hesitant, her fingers gripping the strap of her bag tightly. She wasn't rushing off the way most flight attendants did after landing. She had stayed behind. Leo slowed, glancing in her direction. She looked at him, her face an uncomfortable mix of emotions, regret, guilt, maybe even something resembling respect. This time she didn't try to speak. She didn't force an apology. She simply nodded. A small gesture. Subtle. Leo returned it, and that was enough. He turned back toward Elijah, who was already watching him closely. "Ready to go?" his son asked. Leo adjusted his bag over his shoulder. "Yeah," he said, and together they walked into the night. The cool Atlanta night greeted Leo as he stepped out of the airport terminal, the distant hum of traffic filling the air. The city was alive, as it always was. Cars weaving through highways, streetlights casting long shadows, the scent of rain lingering from a recent shower. Elijah walked beside him, posture straight, his uniform still crisp despite the hours he had spent in it. The soldiers who had accompanied him onto the plane had since dispersed, their mission complete. Leo took a deep breath, letting the air settle in his chest. "Didn't expect all of that," he muttered. Elijah gave a small smile, his hands clasped behind his back. "Figured you wouldn't." Leo shook his head. "You always did like making a scene." Elijah let out a short chuckle. "It wasn't about the scene, it was about the reminder." Leo glanced at his son, waiting. Elijah's expression was unreadable, but there was something steadfast in his voice when he spoke again. I've spent years watching people like you go unnoticed, watching the wrong people get the respect they don't deserve, while the ones who should be honored are overlooked. He paused. I wasn't going to let that happen tonight. Leo studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. I appreciate it, he admitted, the words slow, deliberate. Elijah smiled, knowing how rare it was for his father to say something like that out loud. They reached the curb where a sleek black car was waiting. One of Elijah's men stood beside it, ready to open the door. Leo, however, turned slightly, just enough to see the airport doors behind him. Through the glass, Rebecca Caldwell was still standing inside. She hadn't left yet. She wasn't looking at him directly, but she knew he was there. Leo didn't move, didn't wave, didn't do anything but watch. And then after a long moment, Rebecca did something small, but important. She reached up and removed her name tag. Leo exhaled slowly, watching as she slipped it into her pocket. She wasn't the same woman who had boarded that plane. He didn't know what that moment meant for her, whether she would carry it with her for a lifetime or forget it in a few months. But he did know one thing. She had changed, and that was enough. Without another word, Leo turned and got into the car, the door clicking shut behind him. Elijah followed, and as the car pulled away from the airport, the city stretched before them, wide and open. Leo leaned back into the seat, knowing the lesson had been learned, maybe not by him, but by someone who had needed it more. The car glided smoothly down the highway, the city of Atlanta stretching out around them. The headlights of passing cars flickered like fireflies in the distance, a steady stream of movement in a world that never stopped turning. Leo sat in the back seat, his duffel bag resting beside him. He had traveled countless miles in his life, seen more cities than he could remember, but coming home had always been a different kind of journey. Elijah sat across from him, his posture still military perfect, but there was something more relaxed about the way he carried himself now. The tension of the night had eased, replaced by something quieter. For a while they drove in comfortable silence. Then Elijah spoke. You think she'll remember? Leo didn't need to ask who he meant. Rebecca Caldwell, the flight attendant who had spent the entire flight treating him like he was nothing, only to realize too late who she had been speaking to. He exhaled slowly, watching the lights blur past the window. Maybe, he said. Maybe not. Elijah studied him. Does it matter to you? Leo gave the smallest shake of his head. No, he said. It's not about whether she remembers me. He paused. It's about whether she remembers what she learned. Elijah nodded slowly, letting the words settle. They both knew people like Rebecca weren't rare. They existed in every space. People who judged quickly, who assumed too much, who only saw worth when it was tied to a title, a uniform, a name. Some never changed, but some did. And if tonight had made even one person rethink how they treated the people around them, then maybe it had been worth something. Leo had never cared about recognition, but he did care about the kind of world he left behind, the kind of world his grandson would grow up in. Elijah leaned back, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. You always did have a way of teaching people things without saying much. Leo huffed a quiet breath. You were a slow learner. Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. The car continued down the highway, the city growing closer with every passing mile. And for the first time in a long time, Leo let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the world could still change, one person at a time. The car turned onto a quieter road, leaving behind the rush of the city and moving toward the familiar streets Leo had known for years. The houses here weren't grand, but they were steady, like the people who lived in them. No towering glass buildings, no flashing billboards. Just homes with porches where neighbors still waved to one another, where conversations happened over fences instead of through screens. Leo stared out the window, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. It was strange the way life moved forward while some things stayed exactly the same. You ever think about telling them? Elijah asked suddenly. Leo turned his head slightly, meeting his son's gaze. Telling who? The people on that plane. Elijah exhaled, shaking his head. Not just them, people in general. About what you did, Leo huffed a breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. And then what? Elijah shrugged. Maybe they'd treat you differently. Leo's gaze drifted back to the window. That's the problem, isn't it? Elijah was silent. Respect that only comes after you prove something? Leo continued. That's not respect at all. It's just admiration dressed up as something better. Elijah exhaled, tilting his head slightly. You always were a hard man to impress. Leo gave a small smirk. So were you. The car slowed as they reached Leo's neighborhood, the old familiarity of it settling into his bones like an old song he hadn't heard in years. And then Elijah said something that made him pause. You know, he murmured, you might not care if she remembers, but I do. Leo didn't ask who he meant. Rebecca Caldwell, the woman who had judged him the second she laid eyes on him, who had only changed her tune when she realized her mistake. Leo considered his son's words for a long moment. Then with a slow exhale, he said, people like her. Sometimes they need to be wrong before they can be right. Elijah nodded, understanding. They pulled up in front of Leo's house. The porch light was already on, casting a soft yellow glow over the wooden steps. Elijah turned toward him. You need anything? Leo shook his head. Just some sleep. Elijah smirked. Fair enough. Leo opened the car door and stepped out, slinging his bag over his shoulder. He took a breath of the night air, the kind of breath a man takes when he's finally home. Elijah didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. He just watched as his father walked up the steps, knowing the world had changed a little that night. Not for Leo, but maybe for the people who had been watching. The house was quiet when Leo stepped inside. No hum of a television, no voices filling the space, just the steady rhythm of a home that had been waiting for him. He set his duffel bag down near the door, exhaling slowly as he took in the familiar surroundings. The same wooden floors, the same framed photos on the wall. His late wife's favorite chair sat untouched in the corner, a book still resting on the side table beside it. Everything looked the same, and yet something about him felt different. He moved toward the kitchen, flicking on a light. The glow filled the room, chasing away the shadows that had stretched across the countertops. He reached for the coffee pot, knowing sleep wouldn't come easily. As he waited for it to brew, his thoughts drifted, not to war, not to old wounds, but to a moment he hadn't expected to linger. Rebecca Caldwell, the woman who had spent an entire flight making him feel small, only to be forced to confront the truth. Would she remember? Would she carry the weight of what she had learned? Leo had seen people change before. Some did, some didn't. But tonight, as he stood in his kitchen, the scent of brewing coffee filling the air, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she would. Because the truth was, he hadn't needed her apology. What he had needed was for her to understand. And if she did, if she left that plane seeing the world even slightly differently than when she boarded, then that was enough. Leo poured himself a cup, taking a slow sip. The night stretched on outside, quiet and steady. Tomorrow would come, and it would come differently for the people who had sat on that flight. Rebecca, Greg, the passengers who had watched, who had whispered, who had seen. Leo didn't need them to remember his name. He just needed them to remember the lesson. He set his cup down, exhaling through his nose. Then, with the same steady calm he carried everywhere, he turned off the light and walked toward his bedroom. It had been a long journey, and for the first time in a while, he knew it had mattered. Final reflection, a lesson. Worth remembering, respect isn't something that should be given based on a uniform, a title, or a last name. It's something that should be present from the start, long before we realize who someone is. Leo Henshaw never asked for recognition. He never demanded respect. But through his quiet strength, he reminded everyone on that flight of an undeniable truth. The way we treat people when we think they are nobody says more about us than it does about them. So what about you? Have you ever misjudged someone at first glance? Have you ever been underestimated yourself? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in stories that challenge perspectives and reveal the unexpected, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more lessons waiting to be told.